On the morning of February 22, 2014, a convoy of armored vehicles rolled through the streets of Culiacán, Mexico. Inside apartment 401 of the Miramar beachfront complex, federal agents prepared to breach the door of what they believed to be the most wanted man on Earth. They had intelligence. They had coordinates. They had every reason to believe that today, after 13 years of hunting, Joaquín Guzmán Loera would finally be captured. The battering ram struck the reinforced door once, twice, 3 times before it gave way. Inside, they found rumpled sheets still warm from body heat, clothes scattered across expensive furniture, and a shower stall with its drain cover removed. Below that drain, a dark tunnel descended into the earth. Its walls lined with concrete and dotted with LED lights that stretched into the distance like the throat of some mechanical beast. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán had vanished into the ground itself, escaping through a network of passages that would become the signature of his criminal genius. But what the agents discovered that morning was merely one exit in a labyrinth that stretched beneath 3 countries, cost hundreds of millions to construct, and represented the most sophisticated underground drug trafficking operation in human history. But before the tunnels, before the billions, before the legend of the man who disappeared into the earth became folklore whispered in cantinas across Mexico, there was a boy in the mountains of Sinaloa who learned that the only way out was down. Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera was born on April 4, 1957. In the rural community of La Tuna, Badiraguato, high in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Sinaloa State. The village was not a place that appeared on most maps. It was not a place where futures were built or dreams took flight. It was a collection of dirt floor shacks clinging to mountainsides where opium poppies grew in terraced fields, and poverty was not a condition, but a way of life. A hereditary sentence passed from father to son like a genetic disorder. His father, Emilio Guzmán Bustillos, was a cattle rancher, and Gomero, an opium farmer, who ruled his household with fists that landed like hammers on the bodies of his wife and children. The beatings were frequent. The affection was non-existent. Young Joaquín, small for his age and already bearing the nickname that would follow him into infamy, El Chapo, Shorty, learned early that the world was divided into those who inflicted pain and those who endured it. His mother, Consuelo Loera Perez, tried to shield her children from the violence, but in a home where brutality was breakfast conversation and terror was the evening meal, there was little sanctuary to be found. Joaquín was one of 7 children. Though some accounts place the number higher, the exact count lost to the fog of poverty and the deliberate obscurity that would later become his greatest weapon. The family lived without electricity, without running water, without the basic infrastructure that most humans take for granted. They grew beans and corn on steep hillsides where a single misstep could send a man tumbling to his death. They harvested opium when the poppies bloomed, scoring the bulbs and collecting the sticky resin that would be sold to traffickers who moved it north to feed American addictions. Education was a luxury the Guzmán family could not afford. Joaquín attended school sporadically, making it to 3rd grade before the demands of survival pulled him permanently from the classroom. He could read at a basic level. He could perform simple mathematics. But his real education came from watching the traffickers who descended from the mountains with bundles of cash, from observing the power dynamics of men who carried guns and commanded respect. Through fear, from understanding that in Sinaloa, the drug trade was not a criminal enterprise, but the only enterprise, the economic engine that turned in the absence of any legitimate economy. By age 15, Joaquín was working in the marijuana and opium fields alongside his father, learning to cultivate the crops that would become his fortune. But cultivation was grunt work, peasant labor that earned pesos while others made dollars. The real money, young Joaquín observed, belonged to those who moved the product, who controlled the supply chains, who understood that drugs were merely commodities requiring transportation from point of production to point of consumption. It was basic economics. It was capitalism in its purest, most ruthless form. And Joaquín Guzmán, barely tall enough to see over a table, possessed a mind that understood systems, logistics, and the brutal mathematics of supply and demand. In his late teens, Joaquín began working for Pedro Aviles Pérez, known as El León de la Sierra, the Mountain Lion, one of Sinaloa's pioneering drug traffickers who innovated the practice of using aircraft to transport marijuana across the U.S. border. Aviles was a legend, a man who recognized talent regardless of its packaging, and in the short, stocky teenager with the sharp eyes and sharper mind, he saw potential. Joaquín started as a driver, ferrying loads from the mountains to airstrips, but he distinguished himself through reliability, through an almost obsessive attention to detail, through a willingness to work when others rested and to think when others simply obeyed. When Aviles was killed in a police shootout in 1978, Joaquín transitioned into the organization of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the Godfather, who controlled the Guadalajara cartel, the dominant trafficking organization in Mexico during the 1980s. Félix Gallardo was building an empire, coordinating with Colombian cocaine producers and establishing the infrastructure that would transform Mexico from a marijuana exporter into the primary conduit for South American cocaine entering the United States. The money was staggering. The violence was biblical. And Joaquín Guzmán was learning from masters. But Joaquín was not content to remain a soldier. He studied the organization's operations, identified inefficiencies, and began proposing solutions. He understood routes. He understood bribes. He understood that the greatest vulnerability in trafficking was not law enforcement, but internal betrayal, and he cultivated a reputation for absolute loyalty while simultaneously building his own network of trusted operatives. By the mid-1980s, Joaquín was overseeing logistics for major trafficking corridors, earning hundreds of thousands of dollars, and establishing relationships with Colombian suppliers who appreciated his reliability and his capacity to move enormous quantities of cocaine without losses or mistakes. Then, in 1989, everything changed. Félix Gallardo was arrested, and the Guadalajara cartel splintered into smaller regional organizations. The Tijuana Plaza went to the Arellano Félix brothers. The Juarez Plaza went to Amado Carrillo Fuentes. And Sinaloa, poor, mountainous, forgotten Sinaloa, went to Joaquín Guzmán and his partners, Ismael El Mayo, Zambada, and Héctor Luis, El Güero, Palma Salazar. Most observers expected the Sinaloa faction to be swallowed by more powerful organizations. The Arellano Félix brothers had military discipline and political connections. Amado Carrillo had a fleet of Boeing 727s, earning him the nickname Lord of the Skies. What did Sinaloa have? Mountains, poverty, and a short man with a third-grade education who was about to revolutionize drug trafficking through a method as old as warfare itself: tunnels. The idea was not entirely original. Smugglers had been digging crude passages beneath the U.S.-Mexico border for decades, simple dirt holes barely large enough for a man to crawl through, frequently collapsing and killing those inside. But Joaquín envisioned something different, something unprecedented in scale and sophistication. He imagined tunnels that were not temporary burrows, but permanent infrastructure, equipped with ventilation systems, electrical lighting, and rail tracks for moving enormous quantities of drugs beneath the most heavily fortified border on Earth. He imagined a subterranean highway that would render walls, fences, and border patrols irrelevant. He imagined going under the problem rather than through it. The first sophisticated tunnel attributed to the Sinaloa cartel was discovered in 1990, connecting Agua Prieta, Sonora, to Douglas, Arizona. It was approximately 300 feet long, 6 feet tall, and equipped with lighting and ventilation. U.S. authorities were stunned. Mexican authorities were bought. And Joaquín Guzmán was just beginning. Over the next 3 decades, his organization would construct more than 30 major tunnels, though the actual number is believed to be far higher, each one more elaborate than the last, each one representing millions of dollars in construction costs and an engineering ambition that bordered on the obsessive. But the tunnels were not merely for smuggling. They became his escape routes, his signature, his mythology made concrete. As law enforcement closed in, Joaquín would disappear into the earth like a folkloric figure, a modern-day outlaw who could not be caged because he had built his own doors in the floor of the world. By the early 1990s, the Sinaloa cartel was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually, moving cocaine, marijuana, heroin, and increasingly, methamphetamine into the United States. Joaquín was no longer a logistics coordinator. He was a drug lord, a CEO of an international criminal enterprise with thousands of employees, from poppy farmers in the mountains to distributors in Chicago, from corrupt officials in Mexico City to money launderers in Panama. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration had begun tracking him, recognizing that this short man from Tuna was not merely another trafficker, but a strategic genius whose operations were disrupting enforcement efforts across the hemisphere. In 1993, the violence that had simmered between the Sinaloa cartel and the Tijuana cartel exploded into open warfare. On May 24th, gunmen from the Tijuana organization attempted to assassinate Joaquín at the Guadalajara airport, opening fire with automatic weapons in the midst of travelers and tourists. Joaquín escaped, diving between cars and disappearing into the crowd with the instinct of a man who had spent his life preparing for betrayal. But Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, the Archbishop of Guadalajara, was killed in the crossfire, struck by 14 bullets while sitting in his vehicle. The murder of a Catholic cardinal brought international attention and governmental pressure that even Mexico's notoriously corrupt administration could not entirely ignore. On June 9, 1993, Joaquín Guzmán was arrested in Guatemala, where he had fled following the airport shooting. He was extradited to Mexico and sentenced to 20 years in Puente Grande Maximum Security Prison in Jalisco State on charges of drug trafficking, murder, and criminal association. The authorities celebrated. The DEA breathed easier, and Joaquín Guzmán began planning his next tunnel. Puente Grande was designed to be escape-proof, a fortress of concrete and steel housing Mexico's most dangerous criminals under conditions of maximum surveillance and minimal human contact. But Joaquín understood that every fortress has a weakness, and in Mexico, that weakness was always corruption. He began systematically bribing guards, offering them more money than they would earn in a lifetime of government service. He cultivated relationships with prison administrators, with cooks, with laundry workers, with anyone who could be bought or intimidated. Within months, Joaquín was not an inmate, but a resident, receiving catered meals from expensive restaurants, hosting visitors in private rooms, conducting cartel business through smuggled cell phones, and even paying for sexual encounters with female visitors who were escorted to his cell by complicit guards. The bribes were astronomical. Reports would later estimate that Joaquín spent more than $2.5 million bribing 71 prison officials, from guards earning $200 per month to high-ranking administrators who received single payments of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The corruption was so complete that Joaquín effectively controlled the institution. He was not imprisoned. He was headquartered. By 2001, Joaquín had learned that the Mexican government, under pressure from the United States, was preparing to extradite him to face charges in American courts, where bribery was more difficult and sentences were more severe. Extradition to the United States was the one thing Joaquín feared more than any Mexican prison, the one scenario he could not buy his way out of. And so, on the evening of January 19, 2001, Joaquín Guzmán executed the most brazen prison escape in Mexican history. According to the official story, a narrative so absurd it could only be true in a nation where corruption had become institutional, Joaquín concealed himself in a laundry cart and was wheeled out of the prison by a guard named Francisco Camberos Rivera, who had been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to facilitate the escape. The cart was rolled through multiple security checkpoints, past cameras and observation posts, through corridors where other guards deliberately looked away, and out the prison's front gate. At 9:30 p.m., during the evening head count, Joaquín's cell was found empty. By then, he was miles away, vanishing into the night while 71 complicit officials began constructing alibis and destroying evidence. The Mexican government launched an investigation that was more theatrical than genuine, arresting dozens of guards and administrators while the architects of the escape remained unpunished and Joaquín disappeared into the mountains of Sinaloa. For the cartel, the escape was proof of Joaquín's genius, his invincibility, his divine protection. For the Mexican people, particularly in Sinaloa, he became a folk hero, a modern Robin Hood who had outwitted a corrupt system and returned to the Sierra like a king reclaiming his throne. Corridos, narrative ballads celebrating drug traffickers, were written about his escape, sung in cantinas and on radio stations, turning a criminal into a cultural icon. For the next 13 years, Joaquín Guzmán would be a ghost, a rumor, a name whispered with fear and admiration, simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, building an empire from the shadows while law enforcement agencies in 3 countries devoted hundreds of agents and millions of dollars to his recapture. Following his escape, Joaquín did not go into hiding in the traditional sense. He went underground, both literally and figuratively, constructing a network of safe houses across Sinaloa that were less residences than fortified bunkers connected by tunnels that allowed him to move through Culiacán and other cities without ever appearing on surface streets. These were not crude hideouts, but architectural marvels designed with a paranoia born from experience and funded by a trafficking empire that was now generating $3 billion annually. Some estimates placed the figure far higher. The primary compound was located in Culiacán, the capital of Sinaloa, a city where the cartel's influence was so complete that Joaquín could move with relative freedom, protected by a network of lookouts, corrupt police, and citizens who viewed him as a benefactor rather than a criminal. The compound appeared unremarkable from the exterior, a collection of modest homes in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of structures that would never attract attention. But beneath the surface, Joaquín had constructed something extraordinary. The main house featured reinforced steel doors disguised as ordinary wood, security cameras monitoring every approach, and a panic room accessible through a hidden entrance behind a full-length mirror. But the house's true feature was not visible from any angle above ground. In the master bathroom, the bathtub was not connected to plumbing. It was the entrance to a tunnel system that descended 70 feet below street level, accessed by lifting the entire tub on a hydraulic mechanism to reveal a vertical shaft with a ladder leading into darkness. The tunnel was a masterpiece of engineering. 7 feet tall and nearly 4 feet wide, its walls lined with reinforced concrete to prevent collapse. Every 10 feet, LED lights were mounted to the ceiling, creating a pathway that stretched for more than a mile beneath the city, connecting to multiple exit points, including drainage systems, other safe houses, and a network of secondary tunnels that branched like blood vessels beneath Culiacán. Ventilation shafts disguised as irrigation pipes brought fresh air into the passage. Some sections featured motorized carts on rails, allowing rapid movement of personnel and product through the darkness. The construction had required months of work. Teams of engineers and laborers sworn to secrecy through bribes and threats, and an investment estimated at more than $10 million for this single tunnel complex. But Culiacán was merely the flagship of a network that extended across Sinaloa and beyond. In Mazatlan, a beachfront property featured a similar tunnel system connecting to storm drains and sewers. In Los Mochis, a seemingly ordinary residence contained a network of hidden rooms and escape passages built into the structure's design. In La Tuna, the mountain village of his birth, Joaquín maintained a fortified compound accessible only by helicopter or through mountain trails monitored by lookouts. A sanctuary where he could retreat when urban areas became too dangerous. Each location featured the same obsessive attention to security and the same engineering philosophy. When they come for you, go down. The international tunnel network used for drug trafficking was even more elaborate. The crown jewel was a passage connecting Tijuana to a warehouse in San Diego, California, discovered by authorities in 2016, but believed to have been operational for years before its exposure. This tunnel was nearly half a mile long, descending more than 70 feet below the border, and represented the pinnacle of cartel engineering. Its walls were lined with reinforced concrete. Its floor featured a rail system with motorized carts capable of moving tons of cocaine in hours. Ventilation systems pumped fresh air throughout the passage. Lighting was provided by hundreds of LED fixtures connected to generators on both ends. The tunnel even featured drainage systems to prevent flooding during rains. The construction required heavy equipment, structural engineers, electrical specialists, and dozens of laborers working in shifts beneath the earth. The warehouse on the San Diego side was purchased through shell companies months before excavation began, its legitimate business operations providing cover for the tonnage of concrete and equipment moving in and out. The warehouse on the Tijuana side was similarly acquired and fortified. When the tunnel was operational, it could move 2 tons of cocaine per hour, the drugs loaded onto carts in Tijuana and unloaded in San Diego, then distributed throughout the United States through a network that reached from California to New York, from Texas to Chicago, from Arizona to Atlanta. The economics were staggering. A kilogram of cocaine cost approximately $2,000 to produce in Colombia. That same kilogram was worth $15,000 in Mexico and $30,000 or more in the United States. The Sinaloa cartel was moving tons per month, generating billions in revenue, while Joaquín directed operations from his tunnel-linked safe houses, communicating through encrypted messages and trusted couriers, never using phones that could be traced, never appearing in public locations that could be photographed, existing as an idea more than a man. Comment Tunnel King if you're amazed by the engineering genius of these underground passages. The United States government designated Joaquín Guzmán as Public Enemy Number 1, a title not used since the days of Al Capone, offering a $5 million reward for information leading to his capture. The Drug Enforcement Administration assembled a task force dedicated solely to tracking him, codenamed Operation Gargoyle, involving hundreds of agents and billions of dollars in surveillance technology, intelligence gathering, and international cooperation. The Mexican government deployed thousands of soldiers to Sinaloa, conducting raids on suspected safe houses and checkpoints on mountain roads. And Joaquín disappeared into his tunnels, emerging only when necessary, conducting business from below while his legend grew above. But legends attract attention, and attention brings risk. In February 2012, Hollywood actress Kate Del Castillo, famous for her role as a drug lord in the telenovela La Reina del Sur, made contact with Joaquín through intermediaries, expressing interest in producing a film about his life. Joaquín, who had always been sensitive to his public image and fascinated by his own mythology, agreed to meet. Actor and activist Sean Penn, working on an article for Rolling Stone magazine, joined the project, and in October 2015, the three met at a compound deep in the jungles of Durango State. The meeting was surreal, a collision of Hollywood fantasy and criminal reality. Joaquín arrived with armed guards, dressed casually in a baseball cap and button-down shirt, appearing more like a rancher than the world's most wanted fugitive. They drank tequila. They discussed film rights. Sean Penn asked questions about violence and philosophy, while Kate Del Castillo, who Joaquín appeared infatuated with, negotiated details of a biopic that would never be made. The meeting lasted hours, and Joaquín departed into the jungle, confident that his security protocols had kept the location secret. What Joaquín did not know was that the FBI had been tracking Kate Del Castillo's communications for months, monitoring her contact with cartel intermediaries and using that surveillance to narrow the search radius for Joaquín's location. The Sean Penn meeting provided actionable intelligence, and Mexican authorities, working with American agencies, intensified operations in Sinaloa. The net was closing. On October 16, 2015, Mexican Marines conducted a raid on a ranch in the mountains of Cosala, Sinaloa, based on intelligence suggesting Joaquín was present. The assault was military-grade, involving helicopter gunships and dozens of Special Forces operatives descending on the compound. A firefight erupted. 5 cartel gunmen were killed. Joaquín, according to later reports, escaped through, what else, a tunnel, fleeing into the Sierra with a lieutenant and vanishing before the perimeter could be sealed. But in the aftermath, Marines discovered something significant: evidence that Joaquín had been injured during the escape, possibly fracturing his leg during a panicked descent through rough terrain. An injured fugitive was a vulnerable fugitive. Intelligence agencies tracked movements of known associates, monitored communications, and deployed surveillance assets across Sinaloa. On January 8, 2016, acting on information that Joaquín was hiding in Los Mochis, a coastal city in northern Sinaloa, Mexican Marines launched a pre-dawn raid on a nondescript house in a residential neighborhood. The assault began at 4:40 a.m., Marines breaching the exterior walls and encountering immediate resistance from cartel gunmen inside. A firefight erupted, the sound of automatic weapons fire shattering the pre-dawn quiet, tracers lighting up the darkness like fireflies made of death. 5 cartel members were killed. 1 Marine was wounded. And inside the master bedroom, Marines found an empty bed and a bathroom with the bathtub displaced, revealing a vertical tunnel descending into darkness. Joaquín had done it again, lifting the bathtub on its hydraulic mechanism and descending into a tunnel that connected to the city's storm drain system. Emerging several blocks away through a manhole cover, he and his lieutenant, El Cholo Ivan, stole a car at gunpoint and fled toward the outskirts of Los Mochis, believing they had once again escaped the impossible. But this time, the perimeter was sealed. Roadblocks had been established. Federal police intercepted the stolen vehicle on the highway, and after a brief pursuit, Joaquín Guzmán Loera, the man who had spent 13 years as a ghost, was pulled from the car and handcuffed, his face emotionless, his eyes already calculating the next move. The arrest was international news, broadcast live on Mexican television, replayed on networks around the world. Images of Joaquín being perp-walked by Mexican Marines, his face bruised and his eyes defiant, became iconic. The Mexican government celebrated. The DEA exhaled. And in Sinaloa, there was mourning, as if a king had fallen. Joaquín was imprisoned in Altiplano maximum security prison, placed in a cell under 24-hour video surveillance, with guards rotating every hour to prevent bribery. But memories of the 2001 laundry cart escape haunted Mexican authorities, and they knew that Joaquín, even in a cell, was dangerous. On July 11, 2015, before the October raid and January capture detailed above, in a timeline that loops back on itself like one of Joaquín's tunnels, Joaquín had actually escaped from this same Altiplano prison through, incredibly, another tunnel. That 2015 escape from Altiplano had been even more audacious than the laundry cart. From his cell, Joaquín had orchestrated the construction of a tunnel that extended nearly 1 mile from a property outside the prison walls directly to the shower area of his cell. The passage was a technological marvel, 20 feet deep at the property end and descending to 30 feet as it approached the prison, just deep enough to avoid ground-penetrating radar systems. It was approximately 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, equipped with ventilation pipes, electric lighting powered by a generator on the outside end, and a motorized railcart on tracks for rapid escape. The construction had taken months, requiring precise surveying to ensure the tunnel terminated exactly beneath Joaquín's cell, a 1-mile shot that had to be accurate within inches. Workers excavated thousands of tons of earth, reinforced the walls with wooden beams and plastic sheeting, installed the electrical and rail systems, and did all of this beneath the most secure prison in Mexico without detection. The cost was estimated at $5 million. The planning involved architects, engineers, corrupt prison officials providing intelligence about cell locations and guard rotations, and a logistics network that moved equipment and removed excavated soil without arousing suspicion. On the night of July 11, 2015, at approximately 8:52 p.m., Joaquín disappeared from the surveillance cameras in his cell, stepping into the shower area that was obscured from view by a privacy partition. The tunnel opening was hidden beneath a shower drain, the concrete saw cut from below and carefully replaced to avoid visual detection. Joaquín descended through the opening, climbed onto the motorized cart, and rode through a mile of darkness to freedom, emerging in the property's warehouse where associates were waiting with vehicles and weapons. By the time guards noticed his absence during the next scheduled count, Joaquín was miles away, vanishing into the night like smoke through a cracked window. The escape was a humiliation for the Mexican government, proof that corruption was so systemic that even in the nation's most secure facility, money could buy anything, including freedom. President Enrique Peña Nieto faced international criticism. The United States intensified pressure for Joaquín's recapture and immediate extradition, and the manhunt that led to the January 2016 Los Mochis arrest began. After his January 2016 capture, Mexican authorities did not make the same mistake twice. On January 19, 2017, exactly 16 years after his laundry cart escape from Puente Grande, Joaquín Guzmán was extradited to the United States, flown in a plane to Long Island MacArthur Airport, and immediately transferred to a federal detention facility in Manhattan. The United States had been waiting for this moment for decades, and they were taking no chances. Joaquín was placed in solitary confinement, his cell monitored continuously, his contact with the outside world reduced to minimal communication with attorneys through bulletproof glass. No tunnels would be dug in Manhattan. No guards would be bribed in American custody. The empire that Joaquín had built from below was now impossibly above him, beyond his reach. Continuing to operate under the leadership of Ismael El Mayo Zambada and Joaquín's sons, known collectively as Los Chapitos, but without the strategic genius who had created it. The trial began on November 5, 2018, in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York, with Judge Brian Cogan presiding. The prosecution was led by federal attorneys who had spent years assembling evidence, witness testimony, and documentation of the Sinaloa cartel's operations. The case against Joaquín was overwhelming, built not on a single crime, but on a pattern of criminal enterprise spanning 3 decades, involving tons of drugs, billions of dollars, and hundreds of murders. Over the course of 3 months, the trial revealed details of cartel operations that read like fiction. Witnesses testified about the tunnel systems, the bribed officials, the violence inflicted on rivals and traitors. Former cartel members, now cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences, described Joaquín's management style, his paranoia, his cruelty. They spoke of murders he had ordered, of people buried alive, of bodies dissolved in acid, of torture conducted in safe houses while Joaquín watched impassively. They detailed the logistics of cocaine importments, the distribution networks that moved drugs from Colombia through Mexico and into the United States, the money laundering operations that transformed drug proceeds into legitimate assets. The defense attempted to paint Joaquín as a scapegoat, arguing that Ismael Zambada was the true leader of the Sinaloa cartel and that Joaquín was merely a mid-level operator who had been elevated to mythical status by media attention. They pointed out that El Mayo had never been captured, suggesting that authorities had arrested the wrong man. But the evidence was insurmountable. The prosecution presented testimony from 56 witnesses, including 14 cooperating cartel members. They introduced thousands of pages of documents, wiretap recordings, and photographs. They detailed seizures of cocaine traced directly to Sinaloa cartel operations. They documented murders, bribes, and the construction of tunnels that bore Joaquín's signature methodology. On February 12, 2019, after deliberating for 6 days, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all 10 counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, drug trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and firearms charges. The conviction on the continuing criminal enterprise charge, often called the Kingpin Statute, carried a mandatory life sentence without possibility of parole. Joaquín showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his face a mask that had been constructed over a lifetime of concealing weakness. On July 17, 2019, Joaquín Guzmán appeared for sentencing in the same courtroom. Judge Cogan imposed a sentence of life in prison plus 30 years, along with forfeiture of $12.6 billion, an amount calculated based on estimated cartel revenues during Joaquín's leadership, though the true figure was likely far higher. Before sentencing, Joaquín was allowed to speak, and in a rare public statement, he complained about the conditions of his confinement, claiming that the solitary conditions and lack of sunlight amounted to psychological torture. He did not apologize. He did not express remorse. He complained about process, about treatment, about the unfairness of a system that had finally, after decades, held him accountable. Judge Cogan was unmoved, noting that the cruelty Joaquín had inflicted on countless victims far exceeded any discomfort he experienced in detention. The sentence was final. Joaquín Guzmán Loera, the man who had escaped through tunnels and laundry carts, who had built an empire from the mountains of Sinaloa, who had become a folk hero and a nightmare in equal measure, was going to die in prison. On July 19, 2019, Joaquín was transferred to ADX Florence, the administrative maximum facility in Florence, Colorado, known informally as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. ADX Florence is the most secure federal prison in the United States, designed to house inmates who pose extreme security risks or who have proven capable of escaping from other facilities. The conditions are harsh even by prison standards, designed not for rehabilitation, but for neutralization. Inmates spend 23 hours per day in solitary confinement in 7 by 12-foot concrete cells with a single narrow window that provides no view of the outside world. Meals are delivered through slots. Exercise occurs alone in small concrete enclosures. Human contact is minimal and always supervised. The facility houses terrorists, spies, and the most violent criminals in federal custody, including Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and Terry Nichols, conspirator in the Oklahoma City bombing. For Joaquín Guzmán, a man who spent his life moving, escaping, tunneling, existing in motion, ADX Florence is a concrete tomb, a place where the only direction is inward, where the tunnels lead nowhere, where the escape routes have been sealed with steel and surveillance. He is inmate number 89914-053, stripped of name and mythology, reduced to a number in a cell from which no one has ever escaped. The empire he built continues without him, though fractured and embattled. The Sinaloa cartel remains one of the most powerful trafficking organizations in the world, but it no longer operates as a unified entity. Los Chapitos, Joaquín's sons, Iván Archivaldo and Jesus Alfredo Guzmán Salazar, along with half-brothers Ovidio Guzmán López and Joaquín Guzmán López, control factions of the organization, but they lack their father's strategic vision and have become embroiled in brutal conflicts with rival factions, including elements loyal to El Mayo. The violence in Sinaloa has intensified, with cartel wars producing body counts that shock even a nation numbed by decades of drug violence. In January 2023, Ovidio Guzmán López was captured by Mexican authorities in Culiacán, sparking a cartel uprising that effectively shut down the city. Gunmen erected roadblocks, burned vehicles, and engaged in open warfare with security forces, firing on military aircraft with heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The violence left 29 people dead and demonstrated that even with Joaquín imprisoned, the cartel retained frightening operational capacity. Ovidio was extradited to the United States to face drug trafficking charges, another son following his father into American custody. The tunnels that were Joaquín's signature continue to be discovered, each one a monument to his methodology. In 2020, authorities found a sophisticated passage connecting Nogales, Sonora, to Nogales, Arizona, complete with electricity, ventilation, and a rail system. In 2021, another tunnel was discovered in San Luis, Arizona, descending 30 feet below the border and stretching nearly 200 feet. In 2022, a tunnel in El Paso was found to connect to a home in Juarez, equipped with lighting and structural reinforcement. Each discovery prompts the same reaction: amazement at the engineering, frustration at the impossibility of sealing a 2,000-mile border against determined diggers, and the grim acknowledgement that for every tunnel discovered, several more likely remain operational. The mythology of El Chapo has not diminished with his imprisonment. In Sinaloa, he remains a folk hero, a figure celebrated in corridos that play on radio stations and in cantinas, a symbol of defiance against a system viewed as corrupt and illegitimate. His face appears on T-shirts sold in markets. His story has been adapted into television series, documentaries, and books. The Netflix series, El Chapo, dramatized his life across 3 seasons, blending fact and fiction into entertainment that transformed a criminal into a protagonist, a villain into an anti-hero, a man responsible for countless deaths into a figure of fascination. But beneath the mythology lies a ledger written in suffering. The cocaine that moved through Joaquín's tunnels fed addictions that destroyed families across the United States. The heroin and methamphetamine that flooded American communities during the opioid epidemic bore the Sinaloa cartel's fingerprints, contributing to hundreds of thousands of overdose deaths. The violence required to maintain cartel control killed thousands in Mexico, from rival traffickers to innocent civilians caught in crossfires, from journalists who reported on cartel activities to politicians who refused bribes. Entire communities in Sinaloa and beyond have been hollowed out by violence, their young men recruited into cartels or killed by them, their economies distorted by drug money, their futures mortgaged to an industry that produces nothing but misery. The Mexican government estimates that more than 100,000 people have been killed in drug violence since 2006, though the true number is likely far higher, with tens of thousands more disappeared, their bodies buried in clandestine graves scattered across the country. How many of those deaths can be attributed directly to Joaquín Guzmán is impossible to calculate, but his organization was responsible for a significant percentage, making him one of the most prolific killers of the modern era, a man whose business model required death as a cost of operations. If you found this story compelling, share it with someone who needs to understand the true cost of the drug trade. The safe houses that Joaquín built across Sinaloa remain, some abandoned, some repurposed by cartel successors, some discovered and secured by authorities. The primary compound in Culiacán, with its tunnel descending from the bathtub, has become a symbol of his paranoia and genius, photographed and documented, a tourist attraction for those fascinated by criminal history. The Mexican government has occasionally offered tours of seized cartel properties, including some of Joaquín's former residences, allowing citizens to walk through the modest rooms where a billionaire drug lord lived in relative simplicity, seeing the reinforced doors and the tunnel entrances that testify to a life lived in perpetual preparation for betrayal and capture. The Miramar apartment where Joaquín escaped through the shower drain in February 2014 has returned to civilian use, though its history makes it unmarketable at full price. The Los Mochis house where he was finally captured in January 2016 has been seized by the government, another monument to a manhunt that consumed billions of dollars and spanned continents. The tunnel networks beneath these properties remain, too expensive to fill and too extensive to fully map, ghost infrastructure testifying to the obsessive engineering of a man who believed that safety existed only underground. The tunnels connecting Tijuana to San Diego have been filled with concrete, sealed with steel plates, and monitored with sensors, but authorities acknowledge that complete security is impossible. The border is too long, the geology too favorable for excavation, the profits too enormous to discourage attempts. For every tunnel discovered, enforcement officials assume several more are operational. Invisible passages through which drugs flow northward and weapons and cash flow south, an underground economy that exists parallel to the legitimate world above. In ADX Florence, Joaquín Guzmán exists in a different kind of tunnel, one with no exits, no lights at the end, no escape into darkness or daylight. His days are measured in concrete squares and steel doors, in meals delivered through slots and exercise periods in cages, in silence broken only by the sounds of other inmates screaming into the void of their own isolation. He is 67 years old as of 2024, his health reportedly declining, his body breaking down under conditions that destroy men far younger. He will die in that cell, almost certainly, his body eventually removed and likely returned to Mexico for burial. His grave becoming another pilgrimage site for those who confuse criminality with courage. His lawyers continue to file appeals, challenging the conditions of his confinement, arguing that solitary confinement constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, but legal experts give these appeals virtually no chance of success. The United States spent too much effort capturing Joaquín to risk his escape through legal technicalities. He will remain in ADX Florence until death provides the only release from a prison that has never been breached. The fortune he accumulated, estimated at various points to exceed $14 billion, making him one of the wealthiest criminals in history, has largely disappeared, hidden in accounts and properties scattered across the world, controlled by associates and family members, laundered through legitimate businesses and shell companies so complex that tracing the money would require decades of investigation. The United States government has seized some assets, including properties, vehicles, and bank accounts, but the majority of Joaquín's wealth remains beyond reach, a ghost fortune built from ghost tunnels, invisible and untouchable. His children continue the family business, though with varying degrees of success and survival. Some have been killed in cartel violence, some have been arrested and extradited. Some remain at large, operating in the shadows as their father once did, commanding fragments of an empire that no longer recognizes central authority. The Guzmán name, once synonymous with cartel dominance, has become a liability, a target painted on the backs of anyone who carries it. A hereditary curse that money cannot lift. In La Tuna, the mountain village where Joaquín was born, the poverty remains largely unchanged despite the billions that flowed through his hands. The dirt roads are still dirt. The houses still lack reliable electricity and running water. The fields still produce opium and marijuana, the only crops that generate enough profit to sustain life at subsistence level. A small shrine has been erected near the family's original property, decorated with candles and offerings from those who view Joaquín as a saint of narco-traffickers, a patron of the poor who escape the mountains only to be dragged back down by forces that could not be bribed or escaped. The Mexican government periodically destroys the shrine, and devotees periodically rebuild it. A cycle of devotion and erasure that mirrors the larger cycles of the drug trade itself. The tunnels that Joaquín built were never merely infrastructure. They were philosophy made concrete, a worldview that understood safety as something beneath surface appearances, that recognized walls and fences as challenges to be tunneled under rather than obstacles to be respected. They were monuments to paranoia and preparation, to a life lived in perpetual calculation of betrayal and capture, to the belief that the only direction offering escape was down. But in the end, the tunnels failed. The earth that Joaquín disappeared into for decades finally ran out of exits. The passages that carried billions in drugs and enabled impossible escapes became artifacts, discovered and documented, their lights extinguished and their rails rusted. Their engineering marvels transformed into cautionary tales photographed by investigators and tourists alike. The man who made a career of going underground now exists in the most secure above-ground location in America, in a cell where the floor is solid concrete and the only hole leads nowhere. Like this video if you believe that no empire, no matter how powerful, can escape justice forever. The dark story of El Chapo's tunnel empire is ultimately a story about the limits of genius applied to destruction, about the impossibility of building sanctuary from consequence, about the fundamental truth that no amount of money can purchase escape from mortality or accountability. Joaquín Guzmán Loera was brilliant in the way that cancer is brilliant, in the way that viruses are brilliant, adapting and surviving and spreading through systems designed to contain them. But brilliance without conscience is merely efficiency in service of harm. And harm, no matter how sophisticated its methodology, leaves a ledger that eventually demands payment. The tunnels remain, some filled, some sealed, some still operational in networks yet undiscovered. They are the permanent infrastructure of temporary power, the concrete testament to ambitions that exceeded morality but could not exceed mortality. They are the signature of a man who believed he could dig his way to safety, who understood that walls could be tunneled under, but never grasped that some prisons have no physical form, that guilt and consequence are guards that cannot be bribed, that the deepest tunnel in the world cannot provide escape from truth. In the mountains of Sinaloa, opium poppies still bloom in terraced fields. In the streets of American cities, heroin and methamphetamine still destroy lives. In tunnels beneath the border, drugs still flow north and money flows south. The machinery that Joaquín helped build continues operating, indifferent to his imprisonment, proving that he was never as essential as his mythology suggested, that empires built on addiction and violence are self-perpetuating systems that outlive their architects. And in a concrete cell in Colorado, a short man with a third-grade education and a genius for tunnels spends 23 hours per day in silence, his empire reduced to 7 feet by 12 feet. His freedom measured in the single hour per day. He is allowed to pace in a slightly larger concrete cage. His legacy a cautionary tale told in courtrooms and documentaries, a name that will be remembered not for what he built, but for what he destroyed, not for his escapes, but for his final capture, not for the tunnels that carried him to freedom, but for the cell that holds him until death. The walls absorbed the ambition and the paranoia, the violence and the wealth, the escapes and the captures, the mythology and the reality. And in the end, when the last tunnel has been filled, and the last safe house has been demolished, and the last corridor has been sung, what remains is not glory or legend, but a simple truth. That a man who spent his life going down into the earth will be buried in it. That the king of tunnels built his own tomb, one passage at a time. That the only direction left when you've run out of exits is nowhere at all. If this documentary moved you, comment below with your thoughts on whether the drug war can ever be won, or if we're simply filling tunnels that will be dug again. Share this with someone who needs to understand that wealth built on suffering is a fortress with walls made of sand, impressive in construction, but inevitable in collapse. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán is gone now. The empire fragments, the tunnels collapse, but the darkness that created him remains, waiting in the mountains where poverty makes monsters, where the only industry is illegal, and the only escape is through passage underground, through holes in the earth that promise freedom but deliver only deeper imprisonment, through exits that lead nowhere except down, always down, into the dark story that never ends because it is written in the unchangeable geography of human weakness and the eternal mathematics of supply meeting demand in tunnels that stretch beneath every border, every law, every conscience, waiting for the next engineer of escape, who will learn too late that the only tunnel that matters is time, and time's tunnel has no exits at all.